Gabriella stood by the library window. 15 years ago, she had crossed the threshold of this building with the hope of a new life. Now every morning began the same way. Instant coffee in a worn cup and a silent prayer that she would have enough money to cover all her bills this month. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," Betty, the cleaning lady, greeted as she wiped the wooden shelves. "I love this time of day," Gabriella replied, trying to hide the fatigue in her voice. "It's so peaceful here." She walked over to her desk, where there was a stack of unpaid bills. The debts Robert had left behind seemed endless. He had come into her life 10 years ago, a charismatic entrepreneur with big plans and even bigger promises. And then he disappeared, leaving her with $300,000 in loans. Miss Gabriella, a young girl, spoke to her, distracting her from her heavy thoughts. "Could you help me find a book about successful women in business?" "Of course, Lizzie." Gabriella got up from the table. Suddenly she was interrupted by the sharp sound of the phone. The bank's number was displayed on the screen. She pressed reject once again. It was the third call in a week. "You know," Lizzie continued as they walked between the shelves, "my mom always says that at 42 you can still change everything." Gabriella shuddered. She hadn't even noticed how she had reached that age. It seemed like only yesterday that she was dreaming of owning her own publishing house, traveling around Europe, and having a house with a garden. During her lunch break, she allowed herself to go to the Blue Moon coffee shop. She ordered the cheapest latte and sat by the window. At the next table, a young couple was discussing their upcoming trip to Italy. "I booked that hotel in Venice," the girl said enthusiastically. "Can you imagine waking up and seeing the channels?" Gabriella pulled out her phone, mechanically checking the banking app. Minus $73, an automatic charge for the loan. She had $200 left to live on by the end of the month. When she got home, she took a long shower, letting the hot water wash away the stress of the day. On the fogged-up mirror, she wrote with her finger, "Everything will be fine." It was her daily ritual, an attempt to convince herself that something would change tomorrow. There were still boxes of Robert's things in the living room. She couldn't find the strength to throw them away. Maybe there were documents somewhere that would help her find him, to make him answer for everything. Gabriella took an old notebook out of the drawer. On the first page was a list of dreams written 10 years ago. 1. Open my own publishing house. 2. Travel the world. 3. Buy a house by the lake. 4. Have children. She smiled bitterly. Now her only wish was to wake up one morning and not feel this constant fear for tomorrow. Not to count every cent. Not to flinch at every phone call. From the window of her fifth-floor apartment, she could see the city park. Couples, mothers with children, and people walking their dogs were walking there. An ordinary life that seemed out of her reach. That evening she couldn't sleep for a long time. Numbers, bills, and debts were spinning in her head. Tomorrow would be a new day, just like today, and the day after that, and the next month. A vicious circle from which there seemed to be no way out. The morning began as usual. Gabriella was putting new arrivals on the shelves when an elderly man at the front desk caught her attention. He had been standing there for about 20 minutes, flipping through old books, but it was obvious that he wasn't actually reading. "Can I help you?" Gabriella approached him. The man flinched, as if he had been pulled out of deep thought. He was dressed neatly but modestly, a gray sweater, worn trousers, and old-fashioned thin-rimmed glasses. He stuttered, and Gabriella noticed his hands trembling slightly. "My name is Charles. I have a little problem with overdue books." Gabriella opened the database. "Let's see your card." "Charles Wilson," he said quietly, pulling a worn library card out of his pocket. When the amount of the debt appeared on the screen, $48, the man turned pale. "I didn't think it would be that much. You see, I was sick. I couldn't bring the books on time." Gabriella saw him trying to maintain his dignity, but she could see the real desperation in his eyes. My pension. He took out his wallet and Gabriella noticed that there were only a few crumpled dollars in it. Maybe I could pay in installments? At that moment, something clicked inside Gabriella. She remembered her last night, the bills, the fear. But now she was facing a man whose fear was much more real. You know what? She smiled. I will pay off your debt. Charles didn't understand at first. I'll pay the $48, Gabriella repeated, pulling out her card. Nini Shchovi, Vin Sprobuvav Zupiniti Yi. I can't accept. Yes, you can, Gabriella interrupted him gently. Sometimes we all need help. While she processed the payment, Charles stood silently. His gaze was directed somewhere in the distance, as if he saw something outside the library. Why are you doing this? He finally asked. Because I can, Gabriella answered simply. Today I help you, tomorrow someone will help me. Charles looked at the payment receipt for a long time. Then he suddenly looked up. Tell me, Gabriella, if you could change anything in your life, what would it be? This question took her by surprise. She could have said about her debts, her loneliness, her lost dreams. But instead, she simply answered, I guess I would like to finally live without fear of money. Charles nodded slowly, as if he had heard exactly what he expected. Something like determination flashed in his eyes. You know, he said quietly, sometimes the most important changes start with the smallest things. He started to walk out but stopped at the door. Thank you, Gabriella. You have no idea how important this moment was. And he left, leaving behind a strange feeling. It was as if something important had just happened, but Gabriella didn't yet understand what it was. All day she thought about that meeting, about Charles's eyes, his strange question, the way he looked at her before he left. Something about this elderly man made her feel that he saw the real her, not just a librarian, but a person with dreams and fears. In the evening, as she counted the rest of her paycheck, she realized that she had no regrets about spending the $48. A week passed after the meeting with Charles. Gabriella found herself looking for him in the library's patrons. Every time the front door opened, she looked up, hoping to see a familiar figure in a gray sweater. You've been absent-minded lately, Margaret said when Gabriella put a book on the wrong shelf for the third time. I'm just worried about a reader, she replied. An elderly man, Charles Wilson. Have you seen him? Margaret shook her head. No, dear. I don't know, Gabriella sighed. He just disappeared. That evening, as she was closing the library, she noticed Richard, a regular who often stayed late reading newspapers. Mr. Richard, she said to him, you come here often. Do you remember an elderly man, Charles Wilson? Richard looked up from the newspaper. The one in the gray sweater? Yes, I've seen him a few times. Do you know what happened to him? Richard thought about it. About a week ago, I saw an ambulance near the library. I think they took him away. He fell on the stairs. Gabriella felt her heart skip a beat. I thought everyone knew, Richard shrugged. There was a lot of fuss. He also asked not to call an ambulance, but someone did anyway. The next morning, Gabriella came to work earlier than usual. After waiting for the city hospital to open, she dialed their number. Unfortunately, we cannot provide information about patients, the nurse answered. Please, Gabriella insisted. I just want to know if he's okay. Just a minute, the nurse sighed. What did you say his last name was? Wilson. Charles Wilson. A pause. A rustling of papers. Yes, there was a patient like that. He was admitted with a suspected heart attack, but he was discharged 3 days ago. How did he leave? Gabriella was surprised. In his condition. Unfortunately, we can't hold patients by force, the nurse replied. He insisted on being discharged. He did not leave any contact information. Gabriella hung up the phone. Her mind was racing. Why was he in such a hurry to leave the hospital? Where had he gone? Could he have a family that cared about him? She checked Charles's library card. The address was listed, but when Gabriella tried to find it on Google Maps, it turned out that there was no such street in the city. "Gabriella, we have a line," Margaret called. "Yes, I'm sorry." All day she mechanically performed her work, but her thoughts kept returning to Charles. In the evening, on her way home, she even drove past the hospital, although it was in the opposite direction. At home, Gabriella stood by the window for a long time. Somewhere in this city there was an elderly man, perhaps lonely and sick. A man who, for some reason, touched her heart with his story. She pulled out the receipt for his debt, $48. Such a small thing, but for some reason this amount seemed more important than all her own debts. Her phone vibrated. She received a message from the bank about another debit. But today, this usual anxiety seemed distant and unimportant. All she could think about was Charles, his strange question about the changes in her life and the look he gave her before he left. On Thursday, Gabriella worked late at work. A new intern mixed up the catalogs and had to check everything. "Miss Thompson?" The young courier stood at the front desk. "I have an urgent delivery for you." Gabriella looked at the white envelope in his hands in surprise. "Are you sure?" "I didn't order anything." "Gabriella Thompson, City Library," he read. "Is that correct?" She nodded and signed for receipt. The envelope was thick, with no return address. Her name was written in neat handwriting with a slight leftward slant. "Is it important?" Margaret asked as she passed by. "I don't know," Gabriella replied, tearing the envelope open. "Gabriella, when you read this letter, I will be in another city. The doctors insisted on urgent treatment, but before I leave, I have to tell you something. 15 years ago, I lost my wife, Mary. After her death, I pushed my only son away, blaming him for not having time to say goodbye to his mother. That was my biggest mistake. What you did at the library. You didn't just pay for my books. You showed me that kindness still exists. That evening, I found my son's number. It turned out he lives in Portland, has his own company, married, 2 children. Dad?" His voice was the same as 15 years ago. "Is that really you? We talked all night. He told me everything. About his work, about his children, about how he wanted to call me every Christmas. It was the first time I heard about my grandchildren, Thomas and Elizabeth. Elizabeth, like her grandmother. Enclosed is a copy of a bank transfer for $50,000. Do not refuse it. It is not charity. This is my way of thanking you for restoring my faith in people. I know about your debts, about your ex-husband. Michael helped me check everything out. He's a financier. Use this money to start a new life. You deserve it. Thank you, Gabriella, for everything. Sincerely, Charles." Gabriella dropped the letter. Her hands were shaking. She automatically checked the banking app on her phone. A new transfer notification. $50,000. She sat down at her desk trying to process what she had just read. Outside the library window, the first snow was falling, covering the city with a white blanket. It seemed as if nature itself was giving a sign that it was time to start from scratch. 3 days had passed since Gabriella received the letter. Mornings in the library began as usual. The smell of coffee, the rustling of pages, and quiet conversations among the patrons. "You have a visitor," Margaret called. "He says it's important." A man in his 40s in a dark blue suit stood at the counter. Something in his eyes reminded her of Charles. "Miss Thompson?" He held out his hand. "I'm Michael Wilson, Charles's son." Gabriella felt her heart skip a beat. "How is he?" "The surgery was successful," Michael smiled. "He's still weak, but the doctors say he'll be fine. He asked me to tell you to say hello." They sat down at a far table away from prying eyes. "You know," Michael began, "my father told me everything. About that day in the library, about what you did. I've been trying to get through to him for 15 years, and you managed to do it in a few minutes. I just—" "No," he interrupted her. "You did more than you realize." When he called me that evening, Michael was silent for a moment. For the first time in years, I heard life in his voice. He took a folder out of his briefcase. "But I came not only to thank you. I run the development department at the Brookfield Cultural Center. We are looking for someone to fill the position of educational program coordinator." "But I'm just a librarian," Gabriella was confused. 15 years of experience working with people and books. I have a university degree, 3 languages. Yes, I've seen your resume. And most importantly, the ability to see the best in people. These are the kind of specialists we need. He put a booklet in front of her. On the glossy pages were photos of a modern glass and metal building, spacious halls filled with people. "Salary is twice as high as your current one. Full social package. Opportunity to travel. We cooperate with cultural centers across the country." Gabriella flipped through the booklet, feeling her heart beating fast. "This is a very generous offer." "Your father said you dream of change," Michael said gently. "Sometimes fate gives us a chance. You just have to dare to take it." "Can I think about it?" "Of course," he left his business card. "But not for too long. The position is vacant until the end of the week." In the evening, Gabriella sat in the kitchen for a long time, looking at Michael's business card. Elite paper, gold embossed, another world. She remembered her first day at the library. It had seemed like the beginning of a new life. 15 years had passed like a day. The next morning she came to the library earlier than usual. Margaret was already there, shelving the new arrivals. "I'm quitting," Gabriella said instead of greeting her. Margaret slowly put the books down. "Is it because of that man yesterday? I've been offered a new job at the Brookfield Cultural Center." "Brookfield?" Margaret whistled. "That's serious." They sat in the back room for a long time, drinking coffee and talking. About all these years, about readers, about books that had become family. "You know," Margaret suddenly said, "I always felt that you wouldn't stay here forever. You are too bright for this place." 2 weeks flew by like a flash. The last day at the library was special. Readers brought flowers and cards when they learned of her departure. Mrs. Parker, who came every Thursday to read romance novels, even burst into tears. On Monday, Gabriella crossed the threshold of the cultural center. The glass doors opened silently in front of her. Classical music was playing in the spacious lobby, and people were hurrying about their business. "Good morning, Miss Thompson," the receptionist greeted her. "Mr. Wilson is waiting for you." Riding the elevator to the 10th floor, Gabriella remembered the words from Charles's letter. "Change doesn't start with money. It starts when we decide we deserve better." Michael's office was spacious and bright. On his desk was a photo of him with his father and children at a picnic. "Ah, there you are," he smiled. "Are you ready to start?" Gabriella took a deep breath. "I am." That evening she stood at the window of her new office for a long time. The city stretched out below, twinkling with lights. Somewhere in that city was the old library where she had spent 15 years. Somewhere there was an elderly man whose kindness had changed her life. 2 years had passed. Gabriella was sitting in a cozy cafe near the cultural center. Snow was falling outside the window, reminding her of the day she received a letter from Charles. "Your favorite latte," the waitress put the cup in front of her. Now she could afford not the cheapest coffee. Money still mattered, though. She had learned to appreciate every dollar after years of saving. She spent the $50,000 from Charles wisely. She paid off all her debts, renovated her apartment, and invested part of it in educational courses in project management. She didn't become a millionaire or buy her own house. Life turned out to be more realistic. Her new job was difficult. In the first months, she stayed up late studying the documentation and getting acquainted with her new responsibilities. There were moments when she wanted to quit and return to the quiet library, but she managed. Charles Wynne recovered from the surgery, although he could not fully recover. Now he lived with his son in Portland and helped raise his grandchildren. Sometimes he sent her letters, no checks, just news. Gabriella pulled out her phone and checked her work email. Tomorrow was an important presentation of a new educational project. She was no longer afraid to speak in front of people. She had learned to believe in herself.